The negotiation room had its own atmosphere, the kind that forms when enough dangerous people occupy the same space for long enough. Climate-controlled, deliberately neutral, expensive in the way that announced itself through restraint rather than excess. 40 floors above Lagos, and the city below felt like a different world entirely. Zara Okoye had been in rooms like this since she was 12 years old. She stood at the east side of the table in a black suit chosen the way she chose everything, precisely without sentiment for exactly what it needed to do. 29 years old, and she had already outlasted 3 men who had underestimated her, 2 alliances that had tried to use her, and 1 faction that had made the specific mistake of confusing her composure for permission. She was her father's right hand, his sharpest instrument, the Okoye syndicate's most effective argument. She was also, tonight, the only person in the room who had already read what was about to happen, in the way the Day One representative's eyes had moved twice to his colleague, in the slight adjustment of weight that preceded a calculated move, in the specific quality of a silence that was not neutral but loaded. Her hand was already at her side. Her mind was already 3 moves ahead. Then the man across the table made his mistake. Public, deliberate, designed to fracture the summit in the room's most visible register. A move against the Okoye heir calculated to land before she could answer it. He had miscalculated. She was already answering. And then a voice from her left, low, quiet, the kind of quiet that does not need volume because the room has already decided to listen, cut through every other sound in the space with the clean precision of something decided before it was spoken. Touch her again and you'll bury your empire. 6 words. The room stopped. Zara's hand stilled at her side. Not because she needed the intervention. Because she was reading it, cataloging what it meant that a man she had never met had stepped into her moment without being asked, without hesitation, without looking at her first to see if she needed it. She looked at him now. Kang Jae-min was not looking back at her. He was looking at the man who had made the mistake with the patient, unhurried attention of someone already certain of the outcome, waiting only for the other party to reach the same conclusion. Tattooed from neck to temple. Black suit. A gun extended with the steadiness of a man who had never once in his life fired from panic. He did not need her to thank him. She had no intention of thanking him. What she intended, with the full, focused precision she brought to everything that mattered, was to understand exactly what kind of man steps forward in a room like this. And why. The summit room cleared in the way rooms clear after something irrevocable has happened. Quickly, with the particular efficiency of people who understand that the event they just witnessed is above their pay grade and proximity is its own kind of liability. Zara watched them go. She was still at the east side of the table, her weapon holstered, her posture exactly as it had been before the Day One man made his mistake. Nothing about her external presentation had changed. Internally she was running a full accounting of what the last 4 minutes had cost and what they had produced, completely without sentiment before sentiment had a chance to contaminate the analysis. The alliance had held. That was the ledger's first entry. The Day One faction had publicly declared its willingness to move against both organizations. That was the second. And Kang Jae-min had stepped forward before she could, in a room full of witnesses, without looking at her first to confirm she needed it. That was the third. She was still working out exactly where it belonged. Adaora appeared at her shoulder with the quiet efficiency she had demonstrated since the day Zara had promoted her. Present without crowding, informed without being asked. The car is ready, she said. Zara nodded and moved toward the door without hurrying, without looking back at the side of the room where Jaemin's team was conducting its own quiet debrief. She felt him not watching her leave. In the car, Lagos reassembled itself outside the tinted windows, the city's noise and density and complete indifference to what had just happened 40 floors above it. Adaora sat across from her and waited with the patience of someone who knew the information would come when it was ready. After a moment, Zara said, "He moved before I did." Adaora was still. "That doesn't happen," Zara said. It was not a complaint. It was not admiration. It was a fact being filed precisely, without editorializing, into the correct category. She had been in rooms with dangerous men her entire adult life. She knew how they moved and why and what the movement cost them and what they expected in return. She had built her entire operational methodology around the understanding that in any given room, she would be the one moving first and everyone else would be catching up. Jaemin had not caught up. He had been there before the moment required him. She looked out at the city. She thought about his face when the room went still, not satisfied, not performing, just certain. The face of a man who had already resolved the situation internally before any of it was visible externally. She filed that too. On the other side of the city, in a car moving through the same Lagos night in the opposite direction, Shin was asking the same question in the careful way he asked everything he genuinely needed to understand. Jaemin was looking out his own window at his own version of the city. She was already responding, he said. She didn't need me. Shin waited. Then why move? He asked. Jaemin was quiet for a moment. Outside, a cluster of streetlights passed across the glass and were gone. Because she shouldn't have had to, he said. Shin absorbed that. He did not comment on it. He had worked with Jaemin for 7 years and he understood the difference between a statement that invited discussion and one that simply needed to be said. This was the second kind. Neither of them slept well that night. Both of them were already thinking about the next meeting. And neither of them, separately in their respective silences, was thinking about it purely operationally. They would not have admitted that yet. But it was already true. The neutral floor was on the 22nd level of a building that belonged to a holding company that belonged to no one who mattered to this conversation. Zara had chosen it. Jaemin had approved it. The fact that they had reached the same conclusion through separate channels without discussion was something neither of them mentioned and both of them noted. Jaemin arrived first by 8 minutes. Zara arrived exactly on time, which in her world, in any world that understood power, was identical to a statement. She walked in without looking at the clock and sat across from him at the table that had been set up with the specific neutrality of a space designed to give neither party the advantage of familiarity. She put her files on the table. He put his phone face down. They looked at each other across 4 feet of polished surface. Then they worked. The first 40 minutes were clean, shared intelligence on day 1 movements, a territory map that required 2 amendments before both of them accepted it, communication protocols built from scratch because neither of them was willing to use a system that had been designed for someone else's priorities. Zara wrote quickly. Jaemin spoke in precise, unembellished sentences. His team's analyst sat to his left and said almost nothing. Adaora sat to Zara's right and said slightly more, because Adaora had learned that silence in this context was a different kind of statement and chose her words accordingly. The first disagreement arrived at minute 41. Day 1's next likely move. Jaemin's assessment was precision-based. They would target the Alliance's newest and therefore weakest operational node, applying focus pressure to a point that hadn't yet hardened. It was a clean read and it was the read of a man whose methodology was architectural. Find the structural vulnerability and work it. Zara's assessment was different. They would make noise first, she said. Something visible and disruptive, not targeted. Something that forces both sides to look outward before they've finished looking at each other. Jaemin looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them was wrong. They were reading the same enemy through different frameworks and both frameworks were accurate and they were not compatible. The table was quiet. Zara picked up her pen. She drew a third assessment beneath the other 2, a sequence that accounted for both possibilities as phases rather than alternatives, the visible disruption first as a feint, the structural strike following while both organizations were still managing the noise. She slid it across the table without commentary. Jaemin read it. He picked up his own pen and added 1 line, a timing adjustment, a window of vulnerability she had left open that his read of day 1's operational rhythm closed. She looked at the amendment. She looked at him. She nodded once. He slid the document back. The session ran 4 hours over schedule. When the last of both teams had filed out, Zara was still writing. Jaemin was still reviewing. Neither of them moved toward the door. Neither of them remarked on the time. The city outside the windows had gone from afternoon to evening to a specific dark hour that belonged to neither. Adaora appeared in the doorway at some point and looked at Zara with the expression of a woman filing information she would return to later. Then she withdrew without being asked. Shin did something similar on the opposite side of the room. Zara and Jaemin did not notice. They were finishing something. It was more important than the hour. 3 weeks in, the working sessions had acquired the texture of something established. Twice weekly. Always the neutral floor. Always running long. Always producing an output that neither of them would have reached alone, not because they were individually insufficient, but because their methodologies occupied different but adjacent territories, and the overlap between them generated something that had no name yet but was consistently better than either approach in isolation. They had learned each other's tells. Jaemin went still, a different quality of still from his baseline, more internal, the stillness of active recalibration, when a piece of incoming information changed his assessment of a situation. It happened perhaps twice per session, and each time it happened Zara had begun to watch for what came after it, because what came after was always worth understanding. Zara's pen tapped twice against the table, 2 clean precise taps, not impatient but conclusive, when she had already solved a problem and was waiting for the room to catch up. Jaemin had identified this on the fourth session and had started using it as a signal to accelerate his own analysis rather than complete it at his original pace. He had never told her he had noticed it. She had never told him she had noticed him notice. This was the texture of it. The accumulation of observed things, named to neither party, operating silently as a shared language beneath the operational vocabulary they both spoke out loud. The evening of the 23rd day, both teams cleared out earlier than usual. A secondary briefing had pulled Shin and Adaora into separate calls, leaving Zara and Jaemin at the table with the remains of a working dinner Zara had ordered 2 hours earlier because she had observed, without commenting on it, that Jaemin had not eaten since morning. He had eaten without remarking on the food's arrival. She had not remarked on his eating it. The lamp between them was the only warm light in the room. The city was doing its dark and indifferent work outside the windows. He asked her a question. Not operational. Personal. The specific kind of personal that people who deal exclusively in operational language use as a way of saying something they have not yet found the operational framing for. She looked at him across the table. She could have deflected. She had deflected every personal question posed to her by every person in her world for the better part of a decade, and she was exceptionally good at it. The slight redirect, the answer that was technically responsive and entirely uninformative, the pivot back to the work that everyone she had ever worked with had eventually learned to accept as the boundary it was. She looked at Jaemin and decided, for reasons she did not examine fully in the moment, to answer it honestly. She told him the thing he had asked. Not everything, she was honest, not reckless, but enough. The true version rather than the managed one. He received it without reaction. No softening, no performance of empathy, no rush to fill the space the answer left with something more comfortable. He simply received it the way he received all significant information, completely, in silence, giving it the full weight it was owed. Then he told her something in return. Unprompted. His own version of the same question turned back on himself, offered without her asking. She received it the same way. They sat in the quiet for a moment. Then they both picked up their phones and went back to work. But something had shifted by a degree. It was not dramatic. It was not visible to anyone who had not been watching closely. It was the degree by which two people move when they have stopped pretending that a conversation was only about what it was ostensibly about. Both of them felt it. Neither of them named it. Not yet. It started, as sophisticated operations always did, with something that looked like information. A message in Zara's network. A contact 3 removes from the Day 1 faction but close enough to their operational structure to have credibility, suggesting that the Kong organization had been establishing quiet channels with a third party. Not hostile channels. Preparatory ones. The kind an organization builds when it is considering a strategic exit from a current arrangement and wants the next arrangement ready before the current one collapses. It was detailed. It was sourced. It was, on its surface, entirely credible. Zara read it twice. She put it down. She picked it up and read it a third time, this time looking not at the content but at the construction, the specific way the information was assembled, the particular details that had been included and the particular details that were conspicuously absent, the rhythm of the sourcing chain and where it broke and where it didn't. She had seen this before. Not this specific disinformation. This architecture. This methodology. The Day 1 faction had used a version of it 18 months ago against a partnership between two Lagos organizations that had been threatening to consolidate market position in the Eastern Corridor. That partnership had fractured within a week. Both organizations had spent 6 months convinced the other had betrayed them before a third party identified the origin. Zara pulled the files on that operation from her secure server. She laid them against the current intelligence. She began to annotate. Jaemin's request for an immediate meeting came through Shin at 11:40 that night. He had heard the same information through his own network, 6 hours after she had. Her response was to already be at the neutral floor when he arrived. She heard the elevator at 12:15. She did not look up from the table when he came in. She waited until he had crossed the room and stopped at the edge of the spread of documents she had laid out. The current intelligence, the 18-month-old files, the annotated comparison, the origin point circled in red at the top of the chain, and then she said, "It's Day 1. The construction is theirs. I've seen it before." He stood at the edge of the table and read what she had laid out. He read it with the focused speed of a man who processed information the way other people breathed, continuously, automatically, without needing to stop for it. He sat down. "So have I," he said. They looked at each other across the table. The documents were between them, but what was also between them was something that had no entry on any operational ledger. They had both been handed, simultaneously and from separate directions, a clean and credible reason to distrust each other. The information was designed to do one thing: fracture the alliance along the fault line of suspicion that every alliance carries inside it, the permanent question of whether the person on the other side of the table is building toward you or away from you. Both of them had looked at the information and looked at each other and set it down. That choice, made independently, without consultation, without any way of knowing the other had made the same one, sat between them now, weightier than the documents, weightier than the annotated comparison, weightier than any clause in the agreement they had signed. Trust was not something Zara Okoye gave. It was something she observed accumulating in evidence over time until the evidence was sufficient to act on. The evidence, she noted, was becoming sufficient. She did not say this out loud. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her and said, "Let's build the counter." He picked up his pen. They worked until 3 in the morning. When they finally left, the origin point on Zara's document was circled 4 more times, in 4 different colors, each circle tighter than the last. The joint operation was clean in its planning and wrong in its execution, and the distance between those two things cost 2 of Jaemin's men their cover and nearly cost one of them more than that. The debrief happened the following morning. Both full teams, the neutral floor, everything on the table. Zara had the failure analysis completed before anyone arrived. The sequence of events, the decision point where the operation diverged from its plan, the specific gap in the communication protocol through which the problem had entered. She put it in the center of the table and let it sit there while everyone found their seats. The gap was in the handoff protocol, the window between Zara's team's intelligence feed and Jaemin's team's operational response where information was supposed to be verified before action was taken. Zara's original protocol had specified a double confirmation at that window. Jaemin's team had amended it during the second working session, tightening the chain of command on their side to reduce lag time. The amendment was reasonable. It was also, in this specific instance, the thing that had failed. Jaemin read the analysis. He did not read quickly, the way someone reads something they are hoping to find a way around. He read it the way he read everything, completely, in order, giving each section its full weight. When he finished, he put it flat on the table. He looked at his own team for a moment. Then he looked at Zara. "Your protocol was better," he said. "We'll rebuild it your way." No qualification attached to the statement. No performance of reluctant concession. No subtle reframing that would allow him to accept the correction while preserving the fiction that the original decision had been reasonable. Just the fact, stated with the same precision and the same absence of ego that he brought to every other fact he dealt in. Zara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We'll build a third version. Better than both." He looked at her. She looked back. He nodded once. They spent the next 2 hours rebuilding the protocol from the failure point outward, both of them at the whiteboard, her writing, him reading back, the teams on both sides watching the exchange with the specific attentiveness of people witnessing something they will remember. When it was done and both teams had been dismissed, Adaora fell into step beside Zara in the corridor. She said, "I have never seen you defer to anyone." Zara said, "I didn't defer. I collaborated." Adaora looked at her with the expression of a woman who has spent 4 years in close proximity to another woman and understands the difference between what she says and what she means. "Zara," she said, "I know the difference." Zara looked at her. Adaora looked back, steady and entirely without apology. Zara said nothing. She kept walking. But the corner of her mouth shifted by a fraction that she was aware of and did not correct. Adaora, who noticed everything, filed it away. The debrief ran past midnight. Both teams had gone by 11. The secondary analysis complete, the updated protocols distributed, the field teams briefed on revised procedures. The neutral floor was quiet except for the low ambient hum of the building systems and the city, which at this hour had settled into the version of itself that existed only for people with nowhere else to be. Zara was finishing the last documentation. Jaemin was at the other end of the table with a file she had seen him review 3 times in the past hour without advancing past its second page. She looked at him. He was not reading. He was sitting with his elbows on the table and his hands folded, and he was looking at a point on the surface in front of him that was not the file and was not anything visible. It was the look of a man whose internal machinery had, for a moment, simply stopped producing forward motion. She had never seen him do this. She watched him for a moment. She considered letting it pass, treating it the way she treated most things that were not her operational concern, with a careful non-acknowledgement that preserved everyone's dignity and required nothing from either party. She picked up her pen instead. "What does it cost you?" she said. He looked up. His expression moved through something quick and controlled and arrived back at neutral. He looked at her. "The control," she said. "The composure. All of it, all the time, Every room, every meeting, every decision. What does it cost? He was still for a long moment. Not the working stillness. The other kind, the kind that preceded something real. Then he told her. Not everything. Enough. The weight of a name that had been placed on him before he was capable of consenting to its implications. The specific discipline required to maintain, across 15 years in every variety of high-stakes situation, the presentation of a man who is never uncertain, never overwhelmed, never anything other than entirely in command of every variable in his environment. The cost of that discipline. The places where the cost showed, invisibly, in ways he had become expert at not letting become visible. He told her this with the same directness he brought to operational briefings. No performance of vulnerability. No bid for sympathy. Just the information delivered accurately, because she had asked an accurate question. She listened without moving. She did not soften it. She did not rush to fill the space his words left with something more comfortable. She did not tell him it would be all right or that she understood or any of the things people say when they cannot sit still with someone else's truth. When he finished, she said, "Yes. Just that." He looked at her. She said, "I know exactly what that costs." She turned back to her document. He turned back to his. The lamp burned between them and the city outside the floor-to-ceiling windows did its indifferent work, and neither of them said anything else. But something had been set down in the room. Something that had weight and mass and that neither of them would pick back up and carry alone again. Both of them felt it. Neither of them named it. They did not need to. The intelligence came in at 4 in the morning. Zara was already awake. She slept 4 hours on operational nights, and this had been an operational night since the previous week, the kind of sustained low-level alertness that her body had calibrated to over years of living in a world that did not announce its emergencies in advance. She read the intercepts on her secure line with the lamp on and the city beginning its first gray suggestion of dawn outside her window. The intercepts were sophisticated. They were partial in the specific way of information that has been released rather than leaked, shaped to be found rather than accidentally exposed. They suggested, through a chain of communications that was internally consistent and carefully sourced, that the Kong organization had been providing the Day One faction with structural information about Zara's operational network. Not everything. Enough. The specific kind of enough that would, in the hands of an enemy, allow a targeted strike at the Okoye Syndicate's most vulnerable current node. She read them once. She set them down. Ada Ora was at her door 7 minutes later, her voice carrying the specific tight careful quality that meant she was managing her own alarm in real time. She said, "I've seen the intercepts." She said, "I need to know what you want to do." She did not say what she was clearly thinking, which was that the evidence was credible and the implication was serious and the logical operational response was immediate. Zara looked at the intercepts on the table in front of her. She thought about a man who had looked at identical disinformation 5 weeks ago and set it down. She thought about 14 working sessions and the way he absorbed information and the way he had said your protocol was better without flinching. She thought about a file reviewed 3 times without advancing, and the specific exhaustion of someone who has never once had the option of putting it down. She thought about the summit, the first thing, the 6 words, the gun extended with the steadiness of someone who had never acted from panic. She picked up her phone. She called Jamin. He answered on the second ring, which meant he was already awake, which meant he had already seen something. She said, "Day One has fed you something too. Something that looks like me." A beat. He said, "Yes." She said, "Don't act on it." He said, "I haven't." She said, "I know." The line was quiet for a moment. She could hear the particular quality of his silence, not empty, occupied, the silence of a man processing something. He said, "How?" She said, "Because I know how you operate. And this isn't it." Another silence. Longer. She let it sit. Then he said, "The physical strike comes after the disinformation. They'll move within the next 6 hours. They need both of us responding to the intelligence rather than to them." She said, "I know." She paused. "Where are you?" He told her. She looked at the map in her head, the geography of the city, the operational logic, the positions that made sense for what was coming. She told him where she would be. He said, "I'll be there in 40 minutes. She said, "I'll be there in 30. She was. They were standing in the secured ground floor space of a building 3 blocks from the expected strike point when the Day One faction's operational team made its move 4 hours later. They had been there long enough that the waiting had become its own kind of silence. Not uncomfortable, not requiring management, the specific ease of 2 people who have learned each other's rhythms well enough that proximity needs no narration. When the strike came, they were already positioned. Already calibrated. Already moving in the same operational frame without needing to establish it, because they had been building it for weeks. Back to back. Weapons raised. Shared enemy. Neither of them looked at the other to check. They had stopped needing to check. It was not a battle. It was a conclusion. The distinction mattered. A battle has uncertainty at its center, the variable of which side absorbs damage it cannot recover from, the question that runs beneath every exchange of force like a current. A conclusion is what happens when one side has already solved for every variable and the other side has not yet understood that the solving is complete. The Day One faction walked into a conclusion. The operational sequence Zara and Jaemin had been building for 3 weeks, the counterintelligence that redirected Day One's information network, the repositioned field teams that accounted for every likely strike vector, the communication protocol rebuilt from the failure point outward to close every gap that had previously existed, executed with the seamless coordination of people who had stopped needing to narrate their thinking to each other because they were already working from the same frame. It was over in 4 hours. Not cleanly, nothing in their world ended cleanly, and they both understood that and had planned for the versions of uncleanliness that were most likely to occur. But completely. The Day One faction's leadership structure was neutralized, its operational network severed at 3 simultaneous points, its remaining elements dispersed into problems that were other organizations' concerns rather than theirs. When the last communication channel went silent, they were standing in a cleared operations room in a building that had been chosen for this specific purpose. A space that had been set up to serve a single function and that now, its function complete, held only the residue of sustained effort. Empty water bottles, a whiteboard covered in sequences that no longer needed to be sequences, 2 people standing in the middle of it with their weapons lowered and the pre-dawn quiet settling around them like something earned. Jaemin looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. They were both running their accountings, the operational ledgers, the damage assessments, the items that required follow-up, and they were both also doing something else, something that had no entry in any operational document, which was simply standing in the fact of what they had just done together and allowing it to be as large as it was. Ada Ora appeared in the doorway. She looked at Zara. She looked at the room. She looked at Jaemin. She said, with the careful neutrality of a woman choosing every word with full awareness of its weight, "It's done." Zara nodded. She did not move. She was still looking at Jaemin. He was still looking at her. The lamp in the corner of the room cast the space in a low and level light, and in it his face was entirely open, the composure present but not deployed, not working, simply resting. Shin appeared behind Jaemin. He looked at the room. He looked at his boss. He had the wisdom, which he had developed over 7 years of close proximity to a man who communicated volumes through the quality of his silences, to say absolutely nothing. The city outside was beginning its first suggestion of mourning. They had time. Neither of them was in a hurry. The formal ceremony happened 3 days later. Both dynasties present. The document, the signatures, the public declaration that the Okoye and Kong organizations were now a single strategic entity, territory, intelligence, resources, and the combined weight of 2 names that individually commanded respect and together commanded something closer to inevitability. Chief Okoye sat at the head of his family's delegation with the expression of a man who had spent 30 years building something and was watching it become permanent. The Kong elders were present with the rigid ceremonial dignity of people who understood that history was being made and intended to be visibly part of it. It was correct. It was significant. It was, in the language of both their worlds, everything it was supposed to be. It was also not the thing that mattered. What mattered happened 2 hours later, after both families had dispersed and the building had emptied and the city had resumed its ordinary evening business outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 42nd floor. The floor above the summit room, the one with the roof access, the one Zara had gone to because she needed air and height and the specific perspective that came from being above the place where something had started. She heard the door behind her. She did not turn around. She heard him cross the roof to stand beside her. Not close enough to crowd. Far enough that she had the full space of the view if she wanted it. They stood looking at the city for a moment. He said, "I don't have a speech." She said, "I know." She paused. "I wouldn't listen to a speech." He almost made a sound that was not quite a sound. The closest she had heard him come to acknowledging something was funny. She had been cataloging these moments for weeks. This one she filed. He said, "I have operated at the center of my world for 15 years. I have built everything that exists in it from decisions made alone, carried alone, answered for alone." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm very good at alone. I have been good at it for long enough that I stopped noticing it was a choice I was making rather than a condition I was living in." She listened. He said, "You are the first person I have encountered who made the distinction matter." He turned to look at her. I don't have a protocol for what that means. I don't have a framework that covers the specific situation of standing next to someone who matches me completely and discovering that I am not interested in the version of my life that does not include that. He said it the way he said everything that mattered, directly, without embellishment, with total certainty of the content and no certainty whatsoever about what came after it. She looked at him. She said, I already knew. He was still. She said, the summit. When you moved before I did. I already knew what kind of man does that and why and what it costs. She looked at him steadily. I just needed to know if you knew it too. He said, I've known since your face when the room went quiet. You weren't frightened. She said, no. He said, you were deciding. She said, yes. He said, what did you decide? She looked at him. The tattoos, the stillest eyes in every room they had ever occupied together, the man who had never once in her observation acted from anything other than complete internal clarity, and she said, that you were worth the complication. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically. Not with ceremony. With the quiet precision he brought to everything that had genuine weight, careful, deliberate, entirely without performance. She looked at his hand around hers. She looked at him. She let him. The city stretched below them in every direction. The territory they had defended, the alliances they had built, the enemy they had dismantled, the ordinary work of a world that did not know and would not know the specific weight of what had been decided on this roof on this evening by two people who did not have a language for it yet. Behind them, somewhere in the building, the last of the ceremony's participants were leaving. The formal world was concluding. This world, the one that existed between two people who had looked at each other across a summit table and read the same thing and filed it and spent weeks building toward the moment when the filing had enough evidence behind it to act on, was just beginning. He did not release her hand. She did not release his. The fire of a finished war was cooling to embers somewhere behind them, and neither of them looked back at it. They were already looking forward. The most powerful alliances are not built from need but from recognition. The moment two sovereign forces look at each other and understand that what stands opposite them is not a rival to manage but a mirror to trust. This is the story beneath the story. Zara and Jaemin enter the narrative as people who have weaponized their self-sufficiency, who have built their identities so completely around not needing anyone that they have begun to mistake that armor for their actual selves. The world rewarded them for it. Their worlds required it. And so they carried it, past the point where it served them and into the territory where it isolated them, because no one had yet shown them the difference between strength and the performance of strength. The moral is not that powerful people should become soft. Neither of them becomes soft. The moral is that the bravest thing either of them does in the entire story is not tactical. It is the moment they choose to be known by someone who is capable of handling what they find. Real power, the story argues, is not the ability to stand alone. Anyone can learn to stand alone. It is the willingness to choose, with full information and full sovereignty and complete freedom to do otherwise, to stand together. Not from weakness. Not from need. From the rarest and most demanding thing their world contains. Trust that has been built from evidence, extended without guarantee and honored without condition. Zara drops her armor not because she is defeated but because she decides the person on the other side of the table has earned the right to see what is underneath it. Jaemin speaks the truth about his exhaustion not because he breaks but because she created a space in which the truth was safer than the performance. That is the lesson. Safety is not the absence of danger. It is the presence of someone who sees you clearly and does not look away. They built an empire together. But the thing they built that mattered most was not the alliance or the territory or the dismantled enemy or the formalized agreement. It was the specific, unrepeatable architecture of two people who decided that being known was worth the risk of being seen. Every ordinary Tuesday after that was proof that they had been right.